When I opened my eyes that morning, the light in the room was unfamiliar. Not because of the weather, not because of anything visible, just unfamiliar, like something had shifted overnight while I slept. The sheets were tangled around my legs, the way they are when you've turned too many times in your sleep, chasing something nameless in your dreams. I reached for my phone instinctively and saw the time, 6:43 a.m. That was when I realized I wasn't alone. The creak of the floorboard came a split second before I felt a presence, so subtle yet immediate. And then, without a word, I felt warmth brush against my lips. Gentle. Deliberate. Intimate. My eyes opened fully now, and I caught a glimpse of him stepping back, his face unreadable in the dim morning haze. The door hadn't been locked. I remembered that now. I had been careless, or maybe I hadn't. Maybe some part of me wanted exactly this. He didn't stay. He left as silently as he came, and I sat there, stunned, my hand touching my lips as if to confirm it really happened. And it had. The kiss. The silence. The awakening. That's how it started. But before I tell you how everything in my life unraveled, how one quiet moment rippled into everything else, tell me in the comments where you're watching this from. And answer me this, have you ever made a decision so small, so seemingly innocent, that it ended up changing absolutely everything? My husband had been gone for less than 12 hours, and already the house felt like a stranger to me. He left for his business trip like he always did, methodically, predictably, with that same half-smile and that familiar sentence he always threw over his shoulder, "Don't forget to water the monstera." As if I ever did. I remember watching him pull his suitcase down the steps. I'd made him coffee. Not out of love or routine, but because I didn't know what else to do with my hands. He kissed my cheek, not my mouth. I told myself that was normal. After more than 30 years, what did I expect? Fireworks in the driveway? I stood in the doorway until his car turned the corner. I didn't wave. Back inside, I wandered the kitchen, opening and closing cabinets I'd cleaned a dozen times. The silence was deafening, but also strangely clean. No news channel humming in the background. No keyboard clicks. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock that had belonged to my mother. That's when I saw it, the back door slightly ajar. Not wide open, just enough for the wind to nudge it in tiny pulses. I walked over, pushed it shut, and twisted the lock. I wasn't sure if I had locked it the night before. A mistake? Or something else? I told myself it didn't matter. I made another cup of coffee and brought it to the living room, sitting in my usual chair near the window. The neighbor's yard was empty. His truck wasn't in the driveway. I watched a squirrel dart across the fence, its movements jerky and determined. I wished I could feel the same kind of purpose. It was only when I reached to plump the pillow behind my back that I noticed something strange. Tucked between the cushion and the armrest was a movie ticket stub. Crumpled. Old. Faded. I didn't recognize the title. My husband hadn't been to a movie in over a year. And I certainly hadn't. It was dated from 3 weeks ago. I held it for a long moment, then placed it on the coffee table, unsure what it meant or why it made my chest tighten. Coincidence, I told myself. Maybe it had fallen out of my coat pocket. But I hadn't worn that coat since March. The rest of the day passed in a strange daze. I moved from room to room as if inspecting a life I didn't fully remember living. Our bedroom felt too neat, too untouched. I opened the closet and stared at his side, button-down shirts, lined up like soldiers. I reached out and ran my hand across the sleeves, stopping at a navy blue one he hadn't worn in months. That night, I went to bed earlier than usual. The sheets felt stiff. The silence pressed in from every wall. I tried reading, but the words blurred. My eyes kept drifting to the door, closed now, locked, twice checked. But I couldn't sleep. I tossed. Turned. Flipped the pillow. Still couldn't sleep. And then, sometime before dawn, sleep must have taken me, because I woke to light spilling into the room and to that moment. That impossible moment. The warmth. The breath. The presence. His silhouette was barely visible in the dim light. Familiar, yet not. I didn't speak. I didn't even gasp. Something in my body froze, not out of fear, but shock. I wasn't scared. Isn't that strange? And then, just as quietly as he arrived, he slipped away, closing the door behind him without a sound. I sat up, heart racing but not in panic. My hand touched my lips. Still warm. Still real. I walked to the mirror and looked at myself. My hair was a mess. Lines under my eyes. But something else was there, too, something I hadn't seen in a long time. A kind of flush. I went downstairs barefoot. The house was exactly as it had been. No keys missing. No windows open. The door was locked. Maybe he had a key. Maybe I had left it open again. Maybe none of it made sense. But I knew what I felt. And I knew what it meant. I didn't make breakfast. I didn't open the curtains. I just sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mug I'd forgotten to wash from last night. The movie ticket stub still lay on the coffee table. Everything looked normal. But nothing felt that way. I thought about calling him the neighbor. But what would I say? Did you just come into my bedroom and kiss me? It sounded insane. Besides, he wouldn't admit it. Would he? Or maybe I didn't want him to. Maybe part of me wanted it to remain unspoken, undefined. A moment suspended between breath and thought. Between loneliness and something dangerously close to desire. I spent the rest of the day cleaning. Not just wiping counters, but scrubbing floors, bleaching the sink, organizing drawers. As if by sterilizing the house, I could also sterilize my thoughts. By sunset, I was exhausted but unsatisfied. I stood in the shower for what felt like an hour. Let the water sting my skin. Tried to scrub away the memory of that moment. But it clung. It pulsed. When I finally went to bed, I locked the door. Twice. And still, I dreamed of him. Of footsteps. Of breath. Of warmth. The next morning began like a question I didn't know how to answer. I had barely slept. My dreams were light and broken, like shallow water disturbed by passing wind. I woke up before the alarm, before the sun. Just me, the soft blue of early morning, and the echo of something I couldn't name. I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the same cotton sleep shirt from the day before, tracing the outline of the window with my eyes. The house felt colder, although the thermostat hadn't changed. My hands were restless. I made coffee out of habit, but didn't drink it. Instead, I walked from room to room, tidying things that didn't need to be tidied. The silence wrapped around me like static. I went to the backyard and stood in the middle of the grass barefoot. The dew clung to my skin, grounding me in a way I desperately needed. Across the fence, his house was quiet. Curtains drawn. No sign of him. No movement. I waited, though I told myself I wasn't. Around 9, I decided to drive to the store. I didn't need anything, really, just milk, maybe bread. But I needed movement. Purpose. I pulled my hair into a loose bun, threw on jeans and a cardigan, and left without locking the door. The grocery store was mostly empty. A few retirees, a bored-looking teenager stocking shelves. I wandered aimlessly, running my fingers over produce I didn't plan to buy. I reached for a carton of strawberries just as another hand reached for the same one. We both pulled back. It was him. He looked just as surprised. But not ashamed. His face was calm. Almost too calm. He nodded slightly, offering a polite smile. "Strawberries," he said. "Just that." I gave a tight smile, picked another carton, and moved on. But my heart was beating too fast for something so small. We didn't speak again in the store. He was a few steps behind me at checkout, buying only black coffee and eggs. I paid in cash and left quickly, not looking back. But when I walked out, he was there, leaning casually against the hood of his car. Waiting, it seemed. I paused. "You dropped something," he said, and held up a folded grocery list. It wasn't mine. Still, I stepped forward. Took it from his hand. Our fingers brushed. That moment was quiet. Almost forgettable. But not to me. "Thanks," I said. He nodded again. "See you." And then he was gone. I drove home slowly, every red light a chance to breathe. I turned the radio off halfway through a song. Couldn't stand the noise. Back at the house, I unloaded the groceries with deliberate care. Strawberries first. Eggs. Milk. I set everything in the fridge, rearranged the condiments so they looked neater, more structured. Then I wiped the counters. Twice. I checked my phone. No messages. I checked the locks. Door still ajar. I pushed it closed but didn't turn the key. I sat on the couch and stared at the corner where light spilled through the curtains, making patterns on the floor. I thought about what had happened in the store. The touch. His eyes. And then, the knock. Soft. Not urgent. I stood still for a moment. My heart kicked. I didn't expect him, not really. Not so soon. But when I opened the door, he stood there. One hand in his pocket. The other holding a small brown paper bag. "You forgot this," he said. I opened my mouth, closed it again. Took the bag. It was warm. Inside, a cinnamon roll. "I saw you looking at them," he added. "Thought you might want one." He wasn't smiling. But he wasn't cold. "Thanks," I said, again. "Mind if I come in for a second?" he asked. I hesitated, just long enough for it to be noticed. Then I stepped aside. He walked in like someone who had once belonged there. Looked around, hands in pockets, taking in the familiarity of the space. The kitchen, the couch, the way I always left one pillow crooked on purpose. "You live alone?" he asked, though he knew the answer. "My husband's away," I replied. He nodded. "Business trip?" I nodded too. A pause. Then, his voice, low but steady, "Yesterday morning." That wasn't planned. I didn't answer. I didn't look away. "I shouldn't have done it," he added. "I know," I said. Another silence. But it wasn't empty. Then came the moment. The one I didn't anticipate. The one that didn't feel real until it already had happened. We kissed. No build-up. No resistance. No words. Just the heat of proximity, the closeness of breath, and the tilt of two heads leaning toward a moment neither of us fully understood. We kissed. And then I stepped back. He didn't try to follow. "I should go," he said. I didn't stop him. He left through the same door he had come through. I stood in the hallway, staring at the handle for a long time after it clicked shut. The cinnamon roll sat on the counter, untouched. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. Instead, I went upstairs, changed the sheets on the bed, and opened all the windows in the house. Letting the air move through everything. Letting the moment settle. Letting myself feel the weight of something I wasn't ready to name. The day after he kissed me passed in fragments, like pieces of a puzzle scattered across the floor, each one refusing to fit. I kept busy, or rather, I made myself look busy. The vacuum cleaner buzzed through rooms that were already clean. I rearranged the books on the shelf alphabetically and then back again by color. I wiped fingerprints off doorknobs that hadn't been touched. But no amount of surface cleansing could ease the disquiet stirring underneath. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one to tell. My phone stayed silent. The house stayed silent. And I stayed silent with it. I moved through the motions like a shadow of myself. I wasn't sad. I wasn't excited. I was unsettled. Around noon, I decided to go for a walk. Not in our neighborhood, where every face was familiar and every hedge trimmed in perfect symmetry. I drove to the older part of town, where the streets curved without purpose and the trees grew unpruned, stretching their limbs like old secrets. I parked by a small park I hadn't visited in years. It used to be a place I brought my daughter when she was little. Now it just sat there, forgotten, overgrown, honest. The air was thick with humidity, but I welcomed it. It pressed against my skin like a hand, grounding me. I walked slowly, my steps deliberate, letting my eyes drift across the peeling paint of the old bandstand, the benches weathered gray, the cracked path beneath my feet. Everything here had aged without apology. Unlike me, it made no effort to hide it. There were a few people scattered across the park, an old man feeding pigeons, a teenager with headphones, a woman asleep under a tree. No one looked at me. I liked that. I sat on a bench far from the main path. The wooden slats creaked under my weight, but I stayed still. I closed my eyes for a while, not to sleep, but to disappear. Behind my eyelids, I replayed the moment again, his hand brushing mine at the store, the sound of the paper bag, the way his eyes didn't flinch when I opened the door. And that kiss. We kissed. The simplicity of it made it all the more complicated. It wasn't dramatic or passionate. It wasn't even particularly long. But it had settled into me like a slow wave, shifting everything I thought I'd buried. When I opened my eyes, the world hadn't changed. But I had. I didn't stay long. The heat pressed harder now, and the breeze had disappeared. I walked back to the car with a small headache building behind my temples. On the way home, I stopped at the bakery near the roundabout. A place I used to frequent when we first moved here, before routine swallowed spontaneity. Inside, the same woman I remembered stood behind the counter. Her hair was shorter, dyed a harsh auburn now, but her eyes were the same. She smiled like she didn't recognize me. I preferred it that way. I bought 2 pastries I didn't need and a small carton of cream. As she handed me the change, she said, almost witut looking, "You look different. Lighter." I didn't answer. I didn't smile. I just nodded and left. Back home, I set the pastries on the counter, but didn't touch them. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table, tracing the rim of the glass with my finger. The house was still, almost suspiciously so. Like it knew something I didn't. In the living room, the TV remote lay untouched. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, switching on the screen just to fill the space with noise. Some daytime program played, 2 women discussing how to rekindle intimacy in long-term relationships. I muted it. I looked out the window, toward his house. Curtains still drawn. No truck in the driveway. The same stillness as before. But now it felt charged. Like waiting. That evening, I cooked dinner. Nothing elaborate. Grilled chicken and roasted vegetables. I set the table for one, out of habit, and then immediately felt foolish. I ate quickly, not tasting much, then washed the dishes with unnecessary force. The water splashed high against the sink. My hands were pink from the heat. Afterward, I wandered into the bedroom and stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I studied my face, not searching for beauty, but for honesty. The lines around my mouth were deeper now, my jaw softer. My eyes looked tired. But beneath that, something was shifting. I could feel it, even if I couldn't name it. I changed into a loose dress. Something I hadn't worn in months. Not for anyone. Just because it felt like the right thing to do. The fabric was light against my skin, and for the first time that day, I let my body relax into the way it moved. I didn't expect anything to happen. I wasn't waiting for him to come back. I wasn't fantasizing about another kiss. But I wasn't pretending anymore either. That night, I couldn't sleep. I read for a while, an old novel I'd already finished twice. The words blurred. I stared at the same paragraph for 10 minutes and couldn't recall a single sentence. At some point, I got up and wandered into the hallway. My feet were cold against the wooden floor. I stood in front of the front door and listened. Not for footsteps. Not for a knock. Just for silence. It was there, like always. But it wasn't empty anymore. Back in bed, I lay on my side, eyes open, watching the shadow of the ceiling fan spin slowly across the wall. I wasn't afraid. I wasn't ashamed. But I was changing. Something in me had been touched, not just by him, but by the moment itself. The choice. The chance. The realization that my life was smaller than I'd allowed myself to believe, and that maybe, just maybe, I didn't want it to stay that way. I closed my eyes eventually, but I didn't sleep. I just breathed. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt that breath in every part of me. The days that followed unfolded like fabric being slowly unspooled, quiet, smooth, but filled with tension I couldn't explain. Nothing happened, yet everything inside me felt altered. The rooms were the same. The view outside the window hadn't changed. The clocks still ticked with measured regularity. But I felt different moving through it all, like my skin didn't fit the way it used to. I busied myself with little things. I alphabetized the spice rack. I washed the curtains. I pulled weeds from the garden with such precision that my fingernails remained caked with dirt for hours. When I wasn't cleaning, I was walking. Through the neighborhood, past the park, around empty streets that led nowhere in particular. But on the fourth morning, I noticed it. His truck hadn't been in the driveway for 2 days. The blinds in his front window were drawn tighter than usual. His garbage bins, which he always took out on Wednesdays, remained tucked beside the garage. That kind of silence from him wasn't normal, not even for someone as quiet as he had always been. I didn't let myself dwell on it. Until noon. That's when I finally opened the back door and walked across the narrow strip of grass between our homes. I didn't plan anything, no explanation, no excuse. I just went. And when I reached his front steps, I stopped. I didn't knock. I stood there for several seconds, then reached into my cardigan pocket and took out a book. It was an old novel he'd once lent my husband, something about war and rivers. I didn't even know if he wanted it back, but it was something to hold. Something to give. I knocked, once. Then again. No sound came from inside. I started to turn, but the door opened a few inches. He stood there in a plain gray t-shirt, hair slightly mussed, eyes shadowed. He didn't look surprised to see me. I came to return this, I said, holding up the book. He didn't take it. I'm sorry, he said quietly. For what? I asked, though I already knew. He stepped back and opened the door wider. I hesitated. But then I stepped inside. The house smelled like old wood and coffee. A stack of newspapers rested on a chair in the entryway. The living room was dim, the blinds half closed, casting strips of muted sunlight across the carpet. Everything was in its place, but there was a stillness here I hadn't expected. As if the walls themselves had grown tired of waiting. I followed him into the kitchen, which looked much like mine, though more worn, less polished. He gestured toward the table. I sat. He poured coffee into a chipped mug and pushed it toward me, then leaned against the counter. Neither of us spoke for a while. Then, finally, he said, that kiss shouldn't have happened. I looked down at my hands, resting on the table. I know, I said. But it did, he continued, almost in a whisper. And we can't pretend it didn't. I nodded, because denying it felt more dishonest than the act itself. Silence again. But not uncomfortable. More like an exhale. He moved to the window and looked out, then turned back to face me. Why are you here? He asked. It was a simple question. But I didn't have a simple answer. I'm not sure, I said. Maybe to see if it meant anything. Did it? He asked. I didn't respond. Instead, I stood up, left the book on the table, and walked to the door. He didn't stop me. Back at home, I sat on the porch steps for over an hour, letting the afternoon sun warm my shoulders. I watched two squirrels chase each other across the fence, their movements erratic and urgent. I wondered what it would be like to feel that kind of urgency again. That evening, I made soup. Carrot and ginger. Something comforting, something with weight. I stirred it slowly, letting the steam rise to my face. It reminded me of winters past, of quiet dinners with my husband, of holidays filled with stories and candlelight. I didn't call him. The man next door. I didn't go back. But I thought about him. About the way he looked at me, not with hunger or expectation, but with recognition. As if he saw something in me I had forgotten was still there. After dinner, I went upstairs and opened my closet. I stood there for several minutes, scanning the row of blouses and jackets and dresses. I reached for a blouse I hadn't worn in years, soft blue cotton with tiny buttons that always took too long to fasten. I tried it on. It still fit. But the way it hugged my shoulders felt unfamiliar. Almost intrusive. I took it off and folded it back neatly. Before bed, I opened my laptop and scrolled through old photos. My husband and I on vacation. Our daughter's high school graduation. Birthdays, holidays, blurred candids. I studied my own face in each of them. Always smiling. Always poised. But I couldn't find the version of me that felt like today. I closed the laptop and went to brush my teeth. In the mirror, I saw a woman who looked composed but unsettled. A woman who had kept everything in order for decades, and now wasn't sure why. I lay in bed with the windows open. The night air was cooler than expected. I pulled the blanket up to my chest and stared at the ceiling. The fan moved in slow circles. I didn't feel guilt. Not exactly. I felt weight. And complexity. And a kind of quiet ache for something I couldn't name. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. But I knew what I didn't want. I didn't want to keep living as if everything was fine when it wasn't. I didn't want to keep pretending the small, quiet emptiness inside me was just part of aging. I didn't want to keep folding laundry and making polite conversation while parts of me dried up unnoticed. I turned off the light and lay in the dark. somewhere in the silence, I felt a shift. Not loud. Not sudden. But real. The morning arrived quietly, without fanfare. A dull gray light crept across the bedroom walls, softening the corners of the room but doing little to warm the air. I stayed under the covers longer than usual, listening to the creaks of the house as it settled. It was the same routine, yet it felt different, like every motion was layered with new meaning, or perhaps new hesitation. When I finally got up, the silence in the house was deeper than before. Not heavy, exactly, just if present. I moved through the room slowly, as if not to disturb something fragile. The air smelled faintly of coffee, though I hadn't brewed any. A phantom scent, like a memory returning uninvited. I stood at the kitchen sink and stared out the window. His house was visible just beyond the hedge. The blinds were still closed. I wondered if he'd left. If he'd chosen to remove himself from the equation before either of us said something we couldn't take back. It was Saturday, and the town felt stiller than usual. I dressed without thinking too much about it, just a light sweater and pants, nothing that said anything to anyone. I didn't have a plan for the day. I just knew I didn't want to be still. Motion had become my substitute for clarity. I decided to go to the farmer's market on the other side of town. It was something I hadn't done in years, not since my daughter left for college. Back then, we used to make it a ritual: apple cider in the fall, tulips in spring. I drove there with the windows down, letting the cool breeze sting my cheeks. It helped keep me in the present. The market was just as I remembered it: wooden stalls, hand-painted signs, the scent of baked goods mingling with fresh herbs and ripe fruit. People moved at a gentle pace, smiling politely, nodding to one another like they shared some unspoken secret about small-town life. I walked past the flower stalls without stopping, though the bright colors pulled at something inside me. I picked up a basket of pears, paid the vendor, and wandered through the rows with no destination in mind. It felt good to be among people but not of them. To observe without engaging. To breathe without needing to explain anything to anyone. Eventually, I bought a small jar of local honey and a loaf of bread. Comfort items. Familiar. Things I knew how to use. I didn't plan on seeing him there. But as I turned the corner near the end of the row, he was suddenly just there, browsing the stand with homemade preserves, his hands tucked into the pockets of a worn jacket. His eyes met mine before I could decide whether to keep walking. Neither of us looked away. He walked over. I didn't step back. "Morning," he said. "Hi," I replied. My voice didn't tremble, but something inside me did. We stood there for a moment, the sounds of chatter and rustling bags surrounding us like a curtain. He glanced down at my basket and then back up. "Want to grab a coffee?" he asked. I nodded. We didn't say much on the way to the small cafe by the corner. The streets were just starting to stir with the late morning crowd. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and roasted beans clung to the air. We ordered and sat by the window. For a few minutes, we didn't speak. Just sipped and watched people pass. Then he leaned forward slightly and said, "You seem somewhere else." I looked at him. At his eyes. Not searching for answers, just clarity. "I don't really know where I am," I admitted. "But I'm not where I used to be." He nodded slowly, like he understood more than I had said. We didn't speak much after that. It wasn't awkward, it just didn't need words. When the cups were empty, we walked out together, pausing on the sidewalk. I turned to him. "I should get going," I said. He didn't ask where. I started walking, and after a few steps, I heard his voice behind me. I didn't expect this. I stopped, turned just enough to see him. Neither did I. I walked to my car and drove home slowly, the road stretching out in front of me like something waiting to be written on. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw the mail had arrived. Among the usual bills and flyers was a postcard from my daughter. A picture of a lake she'd recently hiked to. On the back, just a few words, asterisk thinking of you. Hope you're finding time for yourself, asterisk. I smiled. Set it on the fridge. Then made tea. The rest of the afternoon passed quietly. I read for a while, then stood by the window again. His truck wasn't in the driveway anymore. I assumed he'd gone back to the market, or maybe nowhere at all. As the sun began to lower, painting long shadows across the living room floor, I felt something stir in me again. Not longing. Not guilt. Something simpler. A need to confront, not avoid. I walked to his house. I didn't knock this time. I didn't have to. He opened the door before I reached for the handle. No words were exchanged. We kissed. No build-up. No hesitation. We kissed. And then, just like that, I stepped back. He didn't follow. I turned and walked home, my steps steady, my breath slow. The air was cool against my skin, but I didn't shiver. Inside, I changed into pajamas, made a small dinner, and ate by the window. I watched the stars blink into view, one by one. I didn't try to name them. I just let them be what they were, distant, silent, unknowable. Later, in bed, I lay on my side and stared at the ceiling. The house was still. My heart was not. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. But I knew I would meet it honestly. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise. The sky outside my window was a soft gray, not yet pierced by light, and for a long time I just lay there, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. There was no urgency in me, no expectation of anything, but I felt a certain restlessness building underneath the stillness, like water pushing against a dam. I knew that something had shifted again, even if I couldn't put my finger on what. I moved slowly through the morning. I made tea instead of coffee and wrapped myself in a shawl, sitting by the window as the sky gradually turned from gray to pale gold. It was Sunday, which used to mean something, brunches, newspapers, lazy afternoons filled with the sound of my husband typing away at his laptop or flipping through travel magazines. But this Sunday held nothing familiar. It stretched before me like a blank page, and I wasn't sure what I was supposed to write on it. I thought about calling my daughter. The idea hovered for a few moments. I even opened my phone and found her name in my contacts. But I didn't press the button. What would I say? That I had kissed a man who wasn't her father? That I didn't know what it meant, or where it was going, or if I even wanted it to go anywhere. That I was beginning to feel things I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years? I put the phone down. Instead, I dressed and went outside. The air was cool, the kind that hints at the changing season. I decided to go to the lake. It wasn't far, just a short drive, and it was early enough that I knew it would still be quiet. That's what I wanted most. Silence, but a different kind of silence. Not the heavy kind that fills the house when nothing is said, but the wide, open kind you only find in nature. When I arrived, the parking lot was nearly empty. A single car was parked near the entrance, dusted in early morning dew. I pulled into a space near the trailhead, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, letting the quiet sink into me. The path to the lake was familiar, even after all these years. I used to come here with my husband when we first moved into the neighborhood, back when we still made time for walks and packed sandwiches in brown paper bags. We'd sit by the water, toes in the sand, making plans we never followed through on. Back then, the future still felt wide and open. Now it felt narrower. Or maybe just more real. The trees arched overhead, their branches just beginning to show signs of autumn, edges tinged with amber and rust. The path crunched beneath my shoes, and I kept my hands in my pockets, walking slowly, breathing deeply. The farther I walked, the more the noise of my thoughts began to dull. It was the kind of quiet that asked nothing of me. When I reached the lake, it was exactly as I remembered. Still. Reflective. The surface held the early morning sky like a mirror. I found a bench near the water and sat, letting my shoulders drop, letting my breath slow. The breeze tugged lightly at my sleeves, and I closed my eyes for a moment. I didn't think about him. Not at first. I thought about myself. About the version of me that used to come here. About the woman I had become in the years since. I thought about the days that had begun to blend together, the routines that had once brought comfort but now felt like confinement. I thought about the softness of aging, how it sneaks in slowly, not only into the body but into the spirit. How you can wake up one day and realize you've stopped expecting anything new. And then I thought of the kiss. The first one. The second. Not the details, those were simple. But the feeling. The after. The way it had unspooled something tightly wound inside me, like a ribbon that had been waiting too long to be pulled loose. It wasn't about him. Not entirely. It was about being noticed. About being seen. I stayed at the lake longer than I planned. Long enough for the sky to shift again, for the early sunlight to spread into full day. Eventually, I stood and walked the path back to my car, slower now, not out of reluctance but because I didn't want to rush the stillness away. On the drive home, I took a different route, one that curved through the older part of town. The buildings were smaller here, less uniform. The sidewalks cracked. The paint on the signs had begun to peel. But there was something honest about it. No pretense. I stopped at a small cafe I hadn't visited in years. Inside, the same brass bell jingled above the door, the same counter lined with faded pastry labels. I ordered tea and a slice of lemon cake, then took a seat by the window. I watched as people passed, couples holding hands, a man walking his dog, a mother pushing a stroller. Each of them absorbed in their own private rhythm. I didn't feel lonely. I felt aware. Back home, the house was as I'd left it. Still. Predictable. But not as suffocating as it had felt before. I opened the windows to let in the breeze, changed into something soft, and curled up in the armchair with a book I didn't plan to finish. Later, while folding laundry, I came across one of my husband's sweaters at the bottom of the basket. I held it for a moment longer than necessary. The fabric was thick and slightly stretched at the elbows, the cuffs faintly pilled. It still smelled faintly of him, soap and cedar. I set it aside. The rest of the evening passed gently. I made soup again, different this time, thicker, something with lentils and cumin. The warmth of it filled the kitchen as the sky outside darkened. I lit a candle, not out of ritual but because I wanted to. It flickered softly on the counter while I ate in silence. Afterward, I cleaned the dishes slowly, dried each one with care, stacked them neatly in the cupboard. I moved with a kind of attention I hadn't shown in years, not because I was trying to distract myself, but because I finally had the space to notice what I was doing. That night, I didn't look out the window toward his house. I didn't pace. I didn't check my phone. I simply got ready for bed, pulled back the covers, and slid beneath them. I lay on my side, the candle still flickering faintly from the bathroom down the hall. I stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of my own breath. There was no plan. No resolution. But for the first time, I didn't feel caught between choices. I just felt present. Entirely, deeply present. It began like most evenings do, quiet, gradual, the day dimming slowly as if reluctant to let go. I had spent most of the afternoon in the garden, pruning back overgrown hydrangeas and pulling the dead heads off the lavender. The air had been warm but forgiving, the kind of late summer breeze that hinted at fall without fully surrendering to it. I wore gloves but removed them halfway through, wanting to feel the earth beneath my fingernails. I needed that grounding. By the time I went back inside, my hands were stained, and I didn't mind. I stood at the sink scrubbing the dirt from my palms, watching as the water ran brown, then clear. The kitchen clock ticked, steady and slow. The house was still. The kind of stillness that doesn't ask anything of you, but makes you wonder if maybe it should. I changed into clean clothes, made a cup of tea, and sat at the table staring at nothing. The postcard from my daughter was still pinned to the refrigerator, slightly curling at the edges. I reread the message even though I had it memorized. There was something comforting about the simplicity of her words, uncomplicated affection, uncomplicated concern. I envied that simplicity. Sometime after 7, I heard footsteps outside. Not loud. Not hurried. Just present. I didn't move at first. I stayed seated, my hand resting on the side of the teacup, fingers wrapped around the familiar curve. But my ears tuned in. A second step. Then the pause. Then the faint knock. I rose without thinking. My feet carried me to the door before my mind caught up. When I opened it, he was there. No explanation. No gift. No expression that demanded anything. Just him. I stepped aside. He entered. We didn't speak. The air between us didn't need words. Something had already been decided long before this moment. Not agreed upon, perhaps, but reached, silently and without resistance. I led him to the living room. The lamp by the corner chair cast a soft amber light over the space. It felt warm. Contained. As if the world beyond the walls had paused to let us move freely within these four corners. We sat for a while. Not facing each other. Just near. I remember noticing how his hands rested on his knees, relaxed but deliberate. How his shoulders seemed to carry a little less tension than the last time I'd seen him. I thought about saying something, anything, but decided against it. Sometimes silence says more. After some time, he turned toward me slightly, just enough to meet my eyes. The look wasn't questioning. It was knowing. We didn't kiss. Not this time. It wasn't needed. Because what happened between us next wasn't about flirtation or confusion or even defiance. It was about release. About standing in the middle of a moment and choosing to be there fully. We spent the night together. I won't describe the details. Not because they were inappropriate or even dramatic. But because they don't belong in words. What mattered more was the aftermath. The quiet. The way we lay side by side without touching, without sleeping, with only the rhythm of our breathing filling the space. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the familiar patterns of shadows from the fan blades, and felt something unravel in me, something that had been knotted so tightly for so long that I hadn't even realized how restricted I'd become. There was no guilt. Not in that moment. There was a clarity that had nothing to do with right or wrong. Just truth. Sometime after midnight, he rose. I watched him gather his jacket, move toward the door. Still, we didn't speak. At the threshold, he turned, eyes catching the lamplight, face unreadable but not distant. Then he left. The door closed behind him with a soft, almost respectful click. I stayed where I was for a while, knees drawn to my chest, the blanket around me untouched. The house didn't feel empty. It felt reset. I eventually stood, turned off the lamp, and walked upstairs. In the bathroom mirror, I looked at myself, my hair flattened on one side, my lips pale, my eyes clear. clearer than they'd been in years. I changed into my nightgown, brushed my teeth, and slipped into bed. The sheets were cool. The pillow smelled faintly of lavender. As I pulled the blanket over my body, I thought of my husband. Not with anger. Not with longing. Just with perspective. For years, we had built something stable. But in that stability, something essential had been lost, eroded quietly, without confrontation, without crisis. And maybe that was the hardest part. There had been no obvious breaking point. Only a slow drifting into silence. Now, there was no more silence inside me. Only space. And within that space, a beginning. Of what, I didn't know. But it was mine. The morning after was not marked by regret, nor was it marked by elation. It was something else, stillness of a different kind. Not the quiet that precedes guilt or confusion, but a pause. As if everything around me had stepped aside for a moment to allow me to simply exist. The sun filtered gently through the sheer curtains, softening the sharpness of the room. I lay there awake for some time, not moving, not thinking in the usual structured way. I wasn't dissecting what had happened. I wasn't rehearsing explanations. I was just letting my body settle into itself. My breath felt fuller, like I had been holding it for years without noticing. Eventually, I got out of bed and made my way downstairs. The kitchen felt familiar, but lighter. Nothing had physically changed, same dishes in the drying rack, same fridge magnets holding old appointment cards and fading photos. And yet, the air felt rearranged. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I was finally seeing things without the filter I'd worn for decades. I brewed coffee, though I didn't really want it. Habit. The scent filled the house, anchoring me to the morning. As I waited for the pot to finish, I stared at the spot on the floor near the sink where the tile had cracked 2 years ago. I remembered how I'd intended to fix it, but never did. Somehow, that tiny imperfection had always bothered my husband more than me. He liked things complete. Uninterrupted. Controlled. The phone rang once and stopped. I didn't check to see who it was. It didn't feel urgent. I sat down at the kitchen table with the coffee I didn't need and simply let the steam warm my face. I thought of him, not with longing, not with attachment. Just awareness. I thought about how he had moved through the night, not as someone taking, not as someone demanding, but as someone present. Fully and quietly present. And then I thought of my husband. He was due home today. The weight of that realization didn't drop heavily on my chest. It settled softly, like a folded blanket. But it brought with it a certain clarity that I had been resisting. I went upstairs and stripped the sheets from the bed. Not because I needed to. Not because anything had happened that required erasure. It was more like starting fresh. A small ritual of reset. I ran a load of laundry, opened windows to let in the breeze, and tidied the living room, fluffing the pillows I rarely used. Time moved slowly. Noon arrived, and with it a text message, * landing in an hour. Can't wait to see you, * simple. Predictable. Loving in a way that felt rehearsed. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I took a shower, longer than usual. I stood under the warm water and let it run across my shoulders and down my back. I didn't rush. I didn't think. I just allowed myself to feel the weight of water and time. Afterward, I dressed in something clean and comfortable. A soft blouse, linen pants. Not trying to impress, not trying to hide. Just choosing myself. I sat in the armchair by the window and watched as the shadows shifted across the yard. Birds came and went from the feeder. A delivery truck passed. Children's laughter floated in from somewhere down the street. Then I heard the familiar sound of tires crunching against our driveway. I stood slowly and went to the door. He stepped out of the car with his usual movements, efficient, a bit distracted, already checking his phone. He looked exactly the same, and yet something inside me braced itself. He smiled when he saw me, walking toward the house with the same tired suitcase he always carried. I opened the door before he could reach for the handle. His eyes softened. "There she is," he said, stepping forward and wrapping his arms around me. I let him. I returned the embrace. It felt habitual. Not false, but structured. Like a scene we had played out many times before. We moved inside, and he set his bag down in the hallway. He asked about the garden, the weather, the neighbor's dog. I answered truthfully, but my words felt trimmed. I was aware of the space between us, not a physical space, but something else. A gap that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had always been there, just unacknowledged. At dinner, we sat across from each other as we always had. I'd made a light salad, warmed up soup I had frozen weeks ago. He complimented the meal, asked about my week. I told him parts of it. The version that fit within our shared narrative. He didn't question the gaps. He talked about his meetings, the hotel, the delayed flights. I listened, nodding in the right places, asking just enough questions to keep the conversation moving. But my mind was not where my body was. It was walking beside the lake again. It was standing in the garden barefoot. It was watching the sun rise over quiet water. When he reached across the table and took my hand, I didn't pull away. But I also didn't lean in. He noticed. I could tell. He didn't say anything. Just gave my hand a gentle squeeze, then let it go. That night, after the dishes were done and the lights were turned off, we lay in bed together for the first time in days. His breathing settled quickly into sleep. I stared at the ceiling, once again watching the slow spin of shadows from the fan. It was quiet. Familiar. But I felt different. Not wrong. Not broken. Just different. As if something in me had shifted permanently, and there was no going back to the version of myself that had once settled so easily into this space. The pillow beside me rose and fell with his breath. I closed my eyes, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I whispered one sentence into the dark, not loud enough for him to hear, not even sure if I wanted to hear it myself. I don't know what this means. But it was the first truly honest thing I had said all day. And that mattered. The next morning was bright, almost too bright. Sunlight spilled aggressively through the curtains, casting strong lines across the floorboards like someone trying to make a point. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of him in the bathroom, the soft shuffle of slippers, the running water, the familiar throat clearing. It should have comforted me. It didn't. When he came back into the bedroom, he smiled in that way he always did after a good night's sleep, soft, content, half-lidded. He kissed the top of my head and told me he'd make coffee. I nodded, and he left the room. I stayed still for several minutes, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of the sheets over my legs and the space next to me that no longer meant what it once had. It wasn't anger or resentment I felt, it was detachment. A quiet realization that closeness without presence could be more isolating than distance itself. I eventually got up, dressed slowly, and tied my hair back. When I came downstairs, the coffee was already poured. He was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through the news on his tablet. I sat across from him, wrapped my hands around the warm mug, and stared out the window. Neither of us said much. He asked if I wanted to do something that afternoon, maybe a drive, maybe lunch by the lake. It was kind, thoughtful, exactly the kind of suggestion a husband should make after returning from a trip. I agreed, though my voice lacked the enthusiasm it might have once carried. He didn't seem to notice. We left the house around noon, driving the familiar roads we had traveled for years. The radio played quietly, some oldies station with songs we both used to hum to. He tapped the steering wheel along with the beat, occasionally glancing over to smile at me. I smiled back, but only with my mouth. We parked near the lake and walked along the gravel path. The water shimmered in the sunlight, families gathered on picnic blankets, children ran barefoot along the shore. It was all idyllic, picturesque. And yet, I felt like an observer. Like I was moving through someone else's memory rather than my own life. We found a bench beneath a tree and sat for a while, watching the waves. He talked about work, about a colleague's recent retirement, about how things were changing. I nodded in the right places, responded with soft murmurs. My mind drifted. I thought about the other lake. The one I'd visited alone. I remembered the silence, the stillness, the way I had felt grounded there for the first time in years. Not because anyone had been beside me, but because no one had been. Because I had been alone with myself, and that had finally felt like enough. He reached for my hand then, and I let him hold it. His palm was warm, firm, familiar. But it didn't anchor me. It reminded me of the version of myself I used to be. The woman who had once looked at this man with absolute certainty, who had once woven her days around his voice, his rhythm, his presence. I wasn't that woman anymore. And I wasn't sure he had noticed. Back home, he napped on the couch, an arm draped over his eyes, soft snores rising in rhythm. I stood in the kitchen, hands idle, unsure of what I was supposed to feel. There was nothing wrong. He was here. He was kind. He was steady. But I felt as if I had been left behind somewhere, and he hadn't realized I wasn't walking beside him anymore. I opened the windows, let the breeze flow through the house, and sat at the dining table with a notepad I hadn't touched in years. The pages were blank. Clean. Open. I picked up a pen and wrote without thinking. Not sentences. Not a letter. Just thoughts. Bits of feeling. Phrases like, I miss who I used to be when no one was watching. Silence is different when it's chosen. Being touched is not the same as being felt. I filled 2 pages before I stopped. In the evening, he suggested ordering in pizza. He remembered the kind I liked. We ate on the couch, legs touching, a movie playing in the background that neither of us really watched. He laughed at a few lines. I pretended to follow along. After dinner, he offered to clean up. I let him. I sat back and watched him rinse the plates, load the dishwasher, dry his hands on the same towel we'd had for over a decade. It was domestic. Familiar. Easy. But easy was not enough anymore. That night, as we got ready for bed, I moved more slowly. I folded my clothes with care, brushed my hair longer than necessary. When I finally lay beside him, he reached for my hand again under the blanket. I didn't pull away, but I didn't hold it either. I let it rest there, still and silent. He whispered, I missed you. I turned slightly, not to face him, just to shift. And I whispered back, I missed me too. He didn't reply. His breathing deepened, and soon he was asleep. I lay there awake, eyes open in the dark, listening to the hum of the fan and the occasional creak of the house settling into night. I thought about the choices I had made. About what they meant. About what they didn't mean. I didn't feel like a woman who had done something terrible. I felt like a woman who had remembered herself. And now, I didn't know where that would lead. But for the first time, I wasn't afraid of finding out.